Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. All names, characters, and events are fictional. I remember the sound before anything else. A deep, steady hum inside the auditorium at Fort Carson on a bright May morning when the air felt thin and expectant. 500 people filled the rows in their best uniforms and pressed suits. Flags lined the stage. The lights were warm on my face as I stood at attention. Staff Sergeant Avery Callahan, age 31. Survivor of an improvised explosive device in Kandahar, now moments away from receiving the Purple Heart Medal. I had imagined this day during long nights in the hospital when my shoulder was locked in a brace and my leg shook with pain. I imagined feeling proud or calm or maybe a little overwhelmed. I did not imagine silence that felt sharp enough to cut. Lieutenant General Richard Holbrook stepped toward me with the medal resting in his gloved hand. The audience stirred lightly as he paused beside me. For a second, I let myself believe that this moment would rewrite everything. The months of recovery, the scar across my shoulder, the nights when memories arrived too bright and too loud. I thought maybe for one breath my family might finally see me not as the child they criticized, but as the soldier who fought to bring my team home. Before the pen reached my uniform, a voice shot through the room. Harsh, familiar, cruel. They gave it to her for bleeding, not bravery. My stepfather, Mark Redding. Every sound collapsed at once. Conversations died mid-word. Boots froze against the floor. I felt the weight of every stare shift toward the third row where he sat with his arms crossed and a smug twist on his mouth as if he had delivered a truth instead of a wound. My pulse slammed in my ears. I kept my posture straight because training holds even when the heart breaks. You will never fully control a battlefield, but you control your stance. General Holbrook did not move for several seconds. His hand hovered inches from my uniform. Then slowly, he lowered the medal and turned his head. His gaze settled on Mark with a calm so cold it hushed the entire auditorium. What happened next did not feel real. The general reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sealed folder, the kind I had only seen carried into briefings that required quiet rooms and locked doors. His voice dropped into something heavier, something final. If only you knew what this man actually did. A ripple moved across the seats. People shifted, craning their necks toward my stepfather. Mark stiffened. His jaw twitched. Even my breath stalled as if my body knew the next words could change everything I thought I understood about the past 2 years. The general lifted the folder higher. The room leaned forward. My heart pounded like a distant explosion rising fast. He opened the first page. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, in a small house on a narrow street where the winters felt longer than the summers and the walls kept more secrets than warmth. People talk about childhood as a golden time, but mine felt more like a long, cold room without doors. In 1999, when I was 6, my father died in a highway accident on his way home from a late shift. I remember my mother kneeling on the kitchen floor after the police left, gripping the hem of my shirt, as if it were the last solid thing in the world. For a while, it was just the two of us moving through the house like ghosts who still had chores to finish. Then, in 2001, she met Mark Redding at the grocery store where she worked nights stocking shelves. He had a smile that looked borrowed and a voice that dipped too easily into sarcasm, but my mother said he had a steady job and that was enough. He moved in after 4 months. I remember watching him unpack his boots on our living room floor as though he were setting down ownership and not belongings. He married my mother the next summer. At first, he acted as if he were doing us a favor by bringing order to the house. Order meant he made the rules, and we followed them without question. He corrected my posture at the dinner table. He monitored my report cards like a warden. He called these lessons for life, but even at 8, I knew the real lesson was fear. When I turned 9, he began making comments that stuck to me like burrs. You are too quiet. You are too slow. You are not tough enough. My mother rarely challenged him. She would fold her hands in her lap and say, "Avery, just do what he says." Peace was her currency, and she paid for it with silence. In 2003, Mark brought his son Ethan into the house. Ethan was 3 years older than me and walked through the doorway as if he were taking his rightful throne. Mark looked at him with pride so bright it felt like a slap. That was the first time I understood what favoritism really looked like. Not a gentle tilt, but a sharp divide. Ethan got the larger bedroom, the new bike, the brand name sneakers, and the extra slice of pizza at dinner. I got what was left. Mark said it was natural to give his son advantages. I remember thinking then, what am I to you if not a child? By the time I turned 12 in 2005, the chores doubled, then tripled. I vacuumed the living room before school, scrubbed the bathrooms after dinner, raked leaves, and shoveled snow. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in front of the television with his feet on the coffee table while Mark nodded at him like he saw himself in that slouch. Whenever I questioned the imbalance, Mark told me responsibility builds character. What he meant was that my labor made his life easier. He had a talent for turning every request into a critique. If the laundry was not folded perfectly, he would say, "My son could do better with his eyes closed." If the dishes had a water spot, he would say, "No wonder you have no friends. You are careless." These comments landed heavier than any slap could. They shaped the way I saw myself. I began moving through the hallways quietly, not wanting to attract attention. I learned to breathe softer, to step lighter, to make myself small. Yet even that was never enough. Ethan picked up Mark comments and sharpened them into taunts. He would block the doorway and grin. "You are too easy to push around. No wonder Dad says you need toughening." I never fought back because fighting back meant punishment. Mark treated my resistance as defiance, and his punishments were lessons in humiliation. Not harm, but sharp enough to bruise the heart. He would make me stand in the cold garage until I apologized for tone. He would take my books and hide them for days, saying I should focus on chores instead of fantasies. My mother would slip out during these episodes pretending to fold laundry or check the mail. Her absence taught me another heavy truth, that some people survive by looking away. By 2007, I had memorized every creak in the house and every trigger in Mark's voice. Anger after work meant he wanted the living room spotless. A smile that was too tight meant he had found some flaw in my behavior that would become a lecture later. Ethan grew louder, meaner, more confident, while I grew quieter. It was routine for him to shove my shoulder as he passed or whisper insults during breakfast. Mark would laugh as though it were normal sibling play, even though nothing about it felt playful. In those years, the first bruises were not on my skin, but on my sense of worth. I kept a small notebook under my pillow where I wrote questions I did not dare speak aloud. Why does he want me to fail? Why does no one stop him? When or how do I get out? Each question was a small spark of rebellion, even if I did not yet understand it. What I did understand was that I was becoming stronger in ways none of them intended. Strength grows quietly when you are forced to carry weight too heavy for your age. Strength builds when you have to wake yourself because no one else will. Strength becomes a companion when the people who should have protected you replace comfort with criticism. By 2008, I was 13 and already older inside than many adults I had met. I had learned to endure Mark discipline, to accept Ethan's superiority, and to survive the small daily storms that never seemed to end. I did not yet know that these early lessons would echo through the rest of my life, shaping the soldier I would become. I only knew that childhood was something I was enduring rather than living. Looking back, that awareness was the first quiet act of resistance and the first sign that one day I would fight to build a life far beyond the reach of the Redding house. Have you ever grown up in a family that forced you to be stronger than your age? By the time I reached my senior year in 2011, I had already learned how to disappear inside my own house. I woke before everyone else to finish chores, slipped through school days unnoticed, and returned home each evening, bracing for whatever mood waited behind the front door. It was a routine of survival, not growth, and at 18, I could feel the walls closing around me more tightly than ever. Mark had perfected the art of criticism, turning every small action into proof that I would never amount to anything. Ethan strutted through the house with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, and my mother moved through the days in a haze of exhaustion, pretending the tension did not exist. That spring, something in me began to shift. Maybe it was the feeling of graduation drawing near, or maybe it was the weight of knowing I could not keep living under the same roof as a man who belittled my every breath. I started walking home from school using the long route past the river just to buy myself a few minutes of quiet. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench watching the water slide past, I saw a pair of soldiers walk by in their uniforms, crisp and steady. They spoke with an ease that caught my attention, not loud or boastful, just confident in a way I had never felt. There was something in the way they carried themselves that lit a spark in me. I wanted that steadiness, that purpose, that sense of forward motion. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like a slow, steady drumbeat. The Army could offer things my home never would: discipline, respect, structure, honor, and most importantly, distance. I went home that night and looked at the cracked ceiling above my bed, imagining a world where I could breathe without fear of Mark, voice slicing through the air. I pictured a life where my worth was measured by effort, not control. The thought grew sharper every day. By late September, I began researching what enlistment required. I borrowed a computer in the school library and read stories of recruits who traded chaos for clarity. Each story felt like a map leading me out of the house that had become too small for who I wanted to be. I kept everything secret because secrets were survival. If Mark sensed even a hint of independence, he found a way to crush it. One night in October, after a long shift, my mother asked gently if I had thought about college. I shook my head. We both knew there was no money for that, even if I had wanted it. What I wanted was freedom. When I finally worked up the courage to mention the Army at dinner in early November, the room froze. Ethan laughed and nearly spilled his drink. My mother went pale. Mark leaned back in his chair with a slow, mocking grin as if he had been handed a gift. "The Army will break you before life does," he said. "You will not last a month." His words hit me with familiar force, but something inside me no longer bowed. Instead, I felt a strange rising calm. I said nothing, just met his stare long enough to let him know the decision was already made. He waved his hand as if brushing away a joke and returned to his meal. But I felt the shift. That night when the house was quiet, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror studying my reflection. I saw someone tired but still standing, someone who had carried more weight than her age should allow someone who deserved a chance to choose her own future. The next week, I took a bus to downtown Toledo on a cold, clear morning. The Army recruiting office sat between a barber shop and a pawn shop with a flag waving overhead. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the door. Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. A recruiting sergeant greeted me with a friendly nod and asked what brought me in. For a moment, I could not speak. Then, the truth rose so naturally it surprised me. I want a life that is mine. He studied me for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity behind my words, then handed me a brochure and asked me to sit. He explained enlistment options, training timelines, benefits, expectations. He did not sugarcoat anything. The honesty felt like oxygen. When he asked if I had support at home, I hesitated, then told him I had support in myself. He nodded as though that answer told him everything he needed to know. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the office several times, completing forms, scheduling tests, practicing for the physical. Each step felt like laying a brick in the foundation of the life I intended to build. At home, I stayed silent about my plans. Mark continued his usual routine of cutting remarks. Ethan kept treating me like background noise. My mother watched me with a confused sadness, as if she sensed I was drifting somewhere she could not reach. The day I received my enlistment date, I stood alone on the sidewalk outside the office, clutching the paper in both hands. The wind was cold, but the sun was bright, and for the first time in years, I felt the warmth on my face without flinching. I walked home slowly, memorizing the weight of the moment. When I reached the front porch, I paused, listening to the muffled sound of Mark shouting at the television. For the first time, that noise did not seep under my skin. Instead, it pushed me forward. At dinner, I placed the enlistment confirmation on the table. Mark stared at it. My mother covered her mouth. Ethan stopped chewing. I braced for an explosion, but instead, Mark laughed. "You think this will fix you," he said. "The Army will chew you up and spit you out." I felt my pulse steady, and for once my voice did not shake. "It will make me something better." He scoffed, but I did not care. In that moment, the house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the place I was finally leaving behind. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake with the enlistment paper beside me. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time, uncertainty felt like freedom instead of fear. I repeated the words that had carried me through the hardest moments of the year. I was not running away. I was running towards something better. When I stepped off the bus at Fort Jackson in the damp heat of South Carolina, the air wrapped around me like a heavy warning. It was July, and the sun glared across the training field, turning every metal surface into something that could burn you if you touched it too long. Drill sergeants waited in a line like statues carved from discipline, shouting orders before our boots even touched the pavement. My heart raced, but for the first time it raced with anticipation rather than fear. The moment I crossed the yellow footprints, I felt the past begin to loosen its grip. Basic training did not care where you came from or what you escaped. It only cared whether you kept moving. The first week was chaos. We learned how to stand, how to salute, how to secure our gear, how to move as one. I stumbled more often than I wanted. I ran slower than I expected. My arms ached during push-ups, and my palms blistered during pull-ups. But each night when lights went out, I felt something quiet building inside me. Not pride yet, but possibility. On the third morning, Drill Sergeant Parker stopped beside me during formation. He was tall, with a voice that sounded like it had been sharpened on gravel and eyes that missed nothing. "Callahan," he barked, "do you know why you are here?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. He nodded as if that silence was the truth he expected. "Because you are stronger than whatever shoved you through that door. Now prove it." His words stayed with me through every mile we ran. The first time we held the M4 rifles during weapons training, I felt the weight of it settle into my hands with surprising steadiness. We spent hours learning the parts, cleaning them, reassembling them, firing them until the recoil became something familiar rather than startling. The pop of rounds against the distant targets echoed in my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt in control of something powerful. I was no longer bracing for someone to yell at me. I was bracing to do better. Fort Jackson demanded everything. Early mornings that began before the sun climbed over the trees. Marches that left sweat running into my eyes. Obstacle courses that scraped my knees and tore dirt into my uniform. Yet every challenge felt cleaner and more honest than anything I had endured at home. Pain here meant progress, not punishment. Effort meant growth, not fuel for someone's judgment. The turning point came during a long sandhill exercise where the heat shimmered above the ground and our legs felt like anchors. Half the platoon struggled, but no one was allowed to fall behind. That day, I began understanding teamwork in a way no classroom or speech could teach. We lifted each other packs and all trudging step by step until the finish line. When we reached the end, sweating, panting, almost collapsing, Drill Sergeant Parker paced before us with his arms folded. "Pain made you," he said, voice firm. "Now discipline will shape you." I felt those words land inside me like a marker drawing a line between my past and my future. During mail call that night, I received nothing. Others opened envelopes from home, reading out jokes, encouragement photos. I watched quietly, but there was no ache, not anymore. I had spent too long waiting for support that never came. Now I was learning to build it inside myself. Over the next weeks, my body grew stronger. Running no longer felt like punishment. My steps grew lighter, my breathing steadier. During rifle qualification, I hit targets that on the first week I could barely see clearly through my sights. In team drills, recruits shouted my name when they needed someone reliable to anchor the formation. Confidence began to kindle in me, faint at first, but real. During chow one afternoon, a recruit named Santos asked if I had ever thought about leadership roles. I laughed because the idea seemed impossible. He shook his head and said, "You are solid, Callahan. People follow solid." His comment echoed in me long after the meal ended. Leadership. Me. The girl who spent years trying not to be noticed. The thought startled me, but it did not feel wrong. Training brought more tests, gas chamber drills that made our eyes burn and lungs seize, nightland navigation where the darkness felt thick and disorienting, fire watch shifts that taught vigilance and patience. Each challenge peeled away another layer of the old me, the one Mark had shaped with criticism and doubt. Here, effort mattered. Here, fairness existed. Here, I began to see who I could be. One evening, while we cleaned equipment, Drill Sergeant Parker stopped behind me. "Callahan, he said you are tougher than you think." I did not answer, but I felt something shift low in my chest, a truth rising from a place I had ignored for years. Tough was not what Mark had called me, but tough was what I was becoming. The real revelation came during a confidence course on a cool September morning. We climbed ropes, crawled under wires, and leaped over wooden barriers. At the final obstacle, a tall wall stood before us. I watched several recruits struggle to pull themselves over. When my turn came, doubt rose for a split second, but training overrode it. I grabbed the rope, hauled myself upward using legs, arms, willpower until my fingers curled over the top and I pushed myself onto the platform. The view from that height was brief but unforgettable. Trees rustling in the breeze, the sun warming my back, the sound of my platoon cheering below. In that moment, I understood what transformation truly meant. I was not strong because I had survived Mark words. I was strong because I had learned to build myself beyond them. When graduation day arrived, I stood with my platoon uniform pressed boots polished heart steady. My mother did not come. Mark did not come. Ethan did not come. But standing among soldiers who had sweated and struggled beside me, I did not feel alone. I felt chosen in the sense that I had chosen myself. As the band played and we marched across the field, I breathed in the scent of cut grass and warm sunlight and understood with absolute clarity that I was no longer who I had been in Toledo. I left that girl behind on purpose. What stepped forward into the next chapter was someone stronger than Mark had ever predicted, someone who no longer needed permission to live. When I arrived at Fort Riley, Kansas in early 2014, the wind rolled across the plains with a sharpness that felt almost familiar. It reminded me of the winters in Ohio, except here the cold carried purpose, not dread. I was 21, newly promoted to specialist, and determined to earn every inch of ground my rank represented. Fort Riley was a place where reputations were built through reliability and sweat, and I intended to prove that the strength I had gained in basic training was not temporary, but permanent. The first year tested me in ways I had not anticipated. Long field exercises, late-night maintenance shifts, endless inspections, conferences, safety briefs, physical fitness tests, and the constant expectation that you would be ready for anything at any moment. Yet instead of feeling overwhelmed, I found myself thriving. I liked the routine, the structure, the clear expectations, the fair consequences. I liked knowing that effort mattered and that my voice no longer disappeared under someone else's shadow. My squad leaders noticed. They began giving me tasks that required trust, securing equipment, leading small details, briefing the newest soldiers. By 2016, I earned my sergeant stripes and the weight of the chevrons settled onto my chest with a heat that surprised me. Pride was not something I had grown up with, but wearing that rank felt like reclaiming something that had been denied to me for years. Leadership did not come instantly. I made mistakes, learned from them, corrected them, and moved forward. I studied my soldiers the way a careful reader studies a book, not to judge, but to understand. I learned which ones were motivated by challenge, which ones needed steadiness, which ones hid fear behind humor, and which ones relied on someone believing in them. When I was placed in charge of a 9-person team in 2017, I stood in front of them with my palms damp and my heart steady. They looked at me not with skepticism, but expectation. They believed I could lead them, and that belief reshaped me from the inside out. We trained together through Kansas heat and Kansas storms, running drills, until our legs felt carved from stone, and our uniforms clung to us with dust and sweat. During those years, I learned the true meaning of respect. It was not about tone or volume or authority. It was about showing up. It was about lifting others when they faltered. It was about knowing that leadership meant being last in line for food and first in line for responsibility. When my soldiers did well, I praised them. When they struggled, I stayed late to help. When they succeeded, I celebrated them louder than anyone else. For the first time in my life, people depended on me in a way that felt healthy, not draining. But while my military life grew stronger, my personal life began unraveling in a direction I should have anticipated. Mark called for the first time in years during a cold January night in 20. His voice held a forced warmth that set off alarms immediately. He asked how I was doing, then paused before shifting the conversation to money. He said the family needed a little help to get back on their feet. He said family is meant to help each other. He said it as though I had somehow forgotten that rule. What he meant was that I was now earning enough to be useful again. I sent a small amount the first time because guilt is a habit that lingers long after the bruises fade. A month later, he asked again. The month after that, he asked for more. Each request came wrapped in the same phrase. Family is meant to help each other. But help in his definition only flowed one direction. My mother never called. When she did answer the phone, her voice was thin as paper. She always said she was fine even when her pauses said otherwise. She never asked Mark to stop contacting me. She never defended me. Silence was her way of staying afloat. Ethan, on the other hand, had no hesitation. He leaned into the pattern Mark established. He asked for money to cover bills, then money to fix his car, then money to cover classes for a program he never attended. He was 24, unemployed, drifting, and somehow still entitled. When I refused, once he responded with a message that read, "You think you are better than us now. Success always went to your head." I stared at the words for a long time before deleting them. Somewhere deep inside, the girl who grew up in Toledo stirred with old instinctive pain, but she no longer controlled me. I tried to distance myself, but family has a way of reaching through the gaps you leave behind. Whenever my phone buzzed with an Ohio area code, I felt a small pull of tension between loyalty and survival. At work, I never let it show. My soldiers needed consistency, and I refused to let old wounds interfere with what I had built here. The contrast between the two worlds sharpened with each passing month. On post, I was Sergeant Callahan, dependable, respected, trusted. Off post, I was still the daughter and stepsister expected to sacrifice without question. During a long field rotation in 2019, my squad and I spent 3 weeks living out of rucks, sleeping under the open sky, briefing missions by red lens light and moving through mud that swallowed our boots. On the final night, we gathered near the vehicles eating cold rations and swapping stories. One of my soldiers asked when I first realized I wanted to be a leader. The answer rose before I could stop it. The moment I realized leadership meant lifting people up, not tearing them down. They nodded thoughtfully, not knowing the full weight behind that statement. Later that night under the stars, I felt the divide more clearly than ever. My past had tried to convince me that I had little value. My present proved the opposite. My rank, my squad, my growing confidence, all of it stood as evidence that Mark had been wrong about me from the beginning. Yet the calls continued, the requests sharpened, and the sense of being pulled back into the old family cycle grew heavier. I began to understand that the real battle ahead of me would not take place on a training field or overseas. It would take place in the quiet spaces between identity and obligation, between who I had been and who I had fought so hard to become. Family exploitation was no longer a pattern. It was a threat, and I was finally ready to confront it. Kandahar in 2022 was a place where the air always seemed to vibrate slightly, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Even before sunrise, the light stretched pale across the horizon, and the dust curled upward with every step we took. I had been in country for 3 months working convoy logistics with a mixed team of seasoned soldiers and a few nervous first-timers who tried to hide their fear behind tight smiles. Our job sounded simple on paper: escort supply trucks between forward operating points and maintain security along routes that never stayed predictable for long. Nothing about Afghanistan was predictable. Every morning I ran my checklist in the dim glow of my headlamp, scanning radios, weapons, spare batteries, night vision devices, medical kits, water levels, fuel status, and truck spacing. Routine was the anchor that kept us steady. Routine was also a lie we told ourselves to mask the fact that danger could breathe right beside us at any time. On the morning it happened, the air felt still in a way I could not name. Not ominous exactly, but paused like a page about to turn. The convoy moved out at first light engines humming in a low, steady rhythm. I sat in the lead vehicle watching the landscape unfold in muted browns and golds, broken only by scattered trees and distant compounds. My driver, Corporal Diaz, chatted lightly about a letter he hoped to receive from home, but I kept my eyes forward, scanning for anything that felt out of place. You learn to trust your instincts in places like this. Sometimes they whisper before the world erupts. About 40 minutes into the route, the radio crackled with routine updates from the rear. Nothing unusual, no chatter, no signs of interference. Then, as we rounded a shallow bend in the road, I saw it. A patch of earth that looked too smooth compared to the jagged terrain around it. I opened my mouth to call it out, but the blast came first. The world split open in a flash of white, then red, then darkness. The force slammed through the vehicle, lifting it off the ground and tossing it sideways like a toy thrown by an angry child. My shoulder struck the metal frame with a crack that sent pain shooting down my arm. My leg twisted beneath me as gravity reclaimed the truck and slammed it onto its side. Dust exploded through the cabin, filling my lungs with grit. For a moment, everything was muffled. Voices sounded underwater. The ringing in my ears drowned out thought. When I finally forced my eyes open, the cabin flickered with small sparks, and Diaz lay slumped against his harness, dazed but breathing. I heard shouting from outside mixed with the distant thump of small arms fire. The ambush had begun. I unbuckled myself with one arm, biting down against the pain burning through my shoulder, and crawled toward Diaz. "Stay with me," I told him, though my voice trembled more than I wanted to admit. He blinked at me, eyes glassy. The passenger door was jammed, so I kicked it open with my good leg, praying it would budge. It took 3 tries before the metal bent enough for me to force my way out into the harsh sunlight. Bullets cracked overhead, snapping into the dirt nearby. Our second and third vehicles had formed a defensive line, but the insurgents were firing from a ridge that gave them a cruel advantage. I dragged Diaz behind the overturned Humvee, using its bulk as partial cover. My injured leg screamed with every movement, but adrenaline masked the worst of it. Training took over. I shouted positions, directed return fire, signaled to the rear vehicles, and tried to pinpoint the origin of the attack. A young private from the third truck crouched beside me, hands shaking. "What do we do, Sergeant?" "We keep each other alive," I said. That steadiness in my voice surprised even me. While our gunners laid suppressing fire, I crawled back into the lead vehicle to retrieve the medical kit. The shattered glass cut into my arm, but I ignored it. Diaz needed pressure on his bleeding shoulder, and the private needed direction before panic swallowed him. Minutes stretched into something that felt unreal. Fear existed, but it lived beneath a shell of determination, so thick I barely recognized myself. When reinforcements finally arrived, the insurgents scattered, leaving behind a trail of silence, broken only by the crackling of the damaged engine. I leaned against the overturned truck with my breath trembling and the realization settling into my bones. I was alive. Diaz was alive. Everyone survived because we had pulled each other through the fire. But when the adrenaline faded, the pain came roaring back. I remember the medic placing a hand on my shoulder, telling me to stay awake. I remember the sky above me impossibly bright. I remember thinking how strange it was that survival could feel both triumphant and unbearable. At the base hospital, the doctors worked quickly. My shoulder joint was damaged and my leg sprained with deep bruising that would take weeks to heal. While I lay in the recovery ward listening to the distant hum of generators, the battalion surgeon told me the incident would be reviewed for award consideration. He said your actions saved lives that day. I nodded, but my mind drifted somewhere else entirely. Not to the field, not to the fire, not to the dust, but to Ohio, to Mark, to the voice that had trailed behind me my entire life whispering, "You are not enough." Even thousands of miles from him, he still appeared in my thoughts uninvited. When the doctor mentioned the Purple Heart recommendation, my stomach tightened. Most soldiers feel pride or disbelief or solemn gratitude. I felt fear, not of the medal, not of recognition, but of his reaction. In the quiet of that hospital room, with my shoulder bound in a sling and my leg wrapped in bandages, one question lingered louder than the pain. What will Mark say this time? When I returned to Ohio for recovery, the air felt heavier than I remembered, as if the town itself knew too much about the past and not enough about who I had become. My arm was still in a sling, and I walked with a slight limp, but I held myself straighter than I ever had, leaving Toledo years earlier. As I stepped into my mother living room, the familiar smell of old carpet and stale coffee wrapped around me like an unwelcome memory. My mother hugged me gently, avoiding my shoulder and whispering that she was glad I was home. For a moment, I let myself believe things might be different. Then Mark stepped into the room. He looked me up and down with a smirk so practiced it barely moved his face. "So this is what the Army calls a hero. Looks like you got a free vacation with benefits." His words sliced through the air, but I did not flinch. In the past, I would have lowered my eyes and swallowed the sting. Now I simply stared back, steady and silent. He waited for a reaction, then scoffed when he did not get one. My mother pretended to straighten a stack of mail as if tidying the room could tidy the tension. Ethan arrived later that evening wearing a hoodie and sneakers that looked new despite his usual claims of being broke. He slouched into the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and cleared his throat in a dramatic way that signaled he wanted something. He asked how Afghanistan was as if he were asking about a weekend road trip, and when I answered briefly, he nodded without interest. Then he delivered his real reason for dropping by. He needed $4,000 for tuition, $4,000 to get his life back on track, $4,000 because he was finally ready to be serious. But I recognized the rehearsed tone and the shifting eyes. My mother avoided my gaze, and Mark watched me closely, waiting to see if the old patterns would return. I asked Ethan directly what the money was really for. His hesitation was small but enough. It was not tuition. It was not school. It was crypto trading he was sure would make him rich if someone would just invest in him. When I said no, his expression curdled. He called me selfish, said soldiers were supposed to help civilians, said family should support family. Mark chimed in with a quiet laugh. "Look at her! Comes home with medals and suddenly she is above us." For the first time, the old shame did not ignite inside me. Instead, something steadier formed a boundary sharper than anything I had felt. "No," I said, a simple word but powerful. Ethan stepped closer, irritation flaring in his eyes. "You owe us," he said, "after all the years we took care of you, the years they took care of me." The lie stung more than the blast that injured my shoulder. Care had never been present in this house. Not real care. Only control masked as responsibility. When I turned toward the hallway, Mark moved to block me, his face twisted. "Do not walk away while we are talking." His voice carried that familiar edge, the one that used to make my stomach drop. But I was not the girl who left this house at 18. I stepped back just enough to create space, then met his stare with a calm I did not fully understand. "We are done talking." The words landed between us like a drawn line. Mark slammed his hand against the doorframe, making the wood rattle. My mother gasped and grabbed his arm. Ethan muttered something under his breath, but I did not hear the words over the rising pulse in my ears. The old pattern was unfolding, resentment, demand, intimidation. But the ending would not be the same. Mark moved as if to corner me, but I held my ground. "I am not your punching bag, Mark." The sentence came out steady, quiet, and final. His face shifted, not with guilt, but with disbelief, as if the idea that I could speak to him without fear rewrote a rule he thought was permanent. My mother kept repeating, "Stop it, stop it!" But her voice trembled with confusion more than conviction. Ethan stepped back, unsure suddenly that the hierarchy he had relied on still existed. I walked to the front door slowly, intentionally refusing to rush, even though adrenaline buzzed through my veins. Speaking that sentence had cracked something open inside me. Not anger, not rebellion, something deeper. Freedom. Mark shouted after me, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of abandoning family, but the insults rolled off me like dust shaken from a uniform. I paused at the doorway and looked back once. The house felt smaller than ever, smaller than the life I had built, smaller than the strength I had earned. My mother stood near the couch, eyes flickering between me and the man she had chosen years ago. Ethan looked irritated more than anything else. Mark glared with the same expression he used when he could not force reality to bend to his control. None of them knew that this moment, not the blast, not the hospital, not the training halls, was the one that would mark the end of my obedience to their expectations. As I stepped onto the porch, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, as if I had crossed an invisible threshold. I could hear Mark yelling behind me, but his voice no longer felt like a command. It felt like an echo, distant and losing strength. That night, as I settled into the small guest room my mother had prepared, I lay awake replaying the confrontation, the tension, the insults, the slammed door, the sentence that had risen from a place I did not know I had. I am not your punching bag, Mark. For years I had carried the weight of his judgment, but now I could feel that weight slipping. Something inside me had finally cracked in the right direction. I was done bending. I was done absorbing. I was done shrinking. I did not know then how far the fallout of that evening would reach, or how loudly the past would fight to reclaim me. I only knew one truth. I was no longer the child who trembled. I was the soldier who refused to kneel. April of 2024 should have felt hopeful. I had been told the Purple Heart ceremony would take place at Fort Carson in May, and that my name would be read before hundreds of service members' families and officials. It was supposed to be a moment of recognition for survival, courage, and duty. Instead, it became the month when the shadows of my past stretched farther than I expected. The first sign arrived quietly. A cousin from my mother's side, whom I had not spoken to in years, sent a short message asking if I was really injured as badly as people were saying. I stared at the words confused. As badly as people were saying? The phrasing felt strange. I asked what she meant, but her replies turned vague. Something about Mark calling relatives, something about concerns that I might be exaggerating wounds to gain benefits, something about wanting to know the truth. Heat climbed slowly into my face, not embarrassment, but a cold, slow anger. I pressed for details and learned that Mark had spent days calling distant relatives, telling them I had played up my injuries to gain attention and financial perks. She said Mark told them it was a minor incident, nothing serious, and that I was using the story to elevate myself. For a moment, it felt as if the world tilted. Not because I believed him, but because I recognized his pattern. Whenever I accomplished something he could not control, he reshaped the story to belittle it. Childhood chores, high school grades, basic training promotions, every achievement had been minimized or mocked. But spreading lies about combat injuries was something darker, something calculated, something that spoke not just to his insecurity but to his need to reclaim power over me in any form he could reach. I tried to shrug it off at first. Family gossip had never stopped me before. But gossip has a way of leaking through cracks into places you never expect. 2 days later, I went to a nearby store to pick up supplies. The woman behind the counter smiled politely, but her eyes lingered on my shoulder sling, with an expression that was not curiosity, but something sharper. When she handed me my change, she said, "I heard you were hurt overseas." I nodded. "Well, some folks are saying it was not that serious." The tone carried a quiet judgment, as if she were waiting to see whether I would defend myself or confess. I walked out of the store, slowly feeling the accusation settle on my skin like dust. That evening, I walked through my mother neighborhood to clear my mind. A neighbor watering her garden hesitated before greeting me. Her eyes darted to my shoulder, then away. Another waved, but with a stiffness I had not seen before. People who once smiled warmly now seemed to study me as if trying to decide whether I was genuine or dramatic. Rumors are insidious. They move quietly but carve deeply. They shift the way people look at you without ever touching your face. The worst part was not the whispering itself, but the realization that it was orchestrated by someone who claimed to be family. When I confronted my mother, she looked torn between confusion and fear. She said Mark had been upset since my visit in December. She said he worried that people would judge the family if attention turned toward me. She said he was only trying to protect their reputation. The excuses scraped raw against my patience. Protecting the family by undermining the only person who had ever escaped that house. My mother asked if I could ignore it for the sake of peace. I told her peace was not built on lies. She fell silent, twisting her hands together as she always did when she could not face the truth. A few days later, while I was preparing my uniform for a fitting appointment, a message arrived from an old classmate. "Heard the ceremony is just for show. Heard you asked for a medal you did not really earn. Heard it was a paperwork favor." I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar tightness return to my chest, the same tightness I had fought for years to unlearn. This was no longer simple gossip. This was sabotage with intent enough to distort the truth into something poisonous. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the silence fill the room. My ribbons lay neatly on the uniform beside me, the fabric crisp, the colors precise. Each stripe represented nights of exhaustion, days of discipline, moments when I held my team together under conditions Mark would never understand. Yet a single lie spoken repeatedly by a man who derived pleasure from control was beginning to stain the edges of this moment. I took a long breath and told myself the same thing I always told my soldiers. Facts outlive rumors. Strength outlasts noise. Still, the hurt lingered sharper than I wanted to admit. I reached out to a fellow NCO at Fort Carson and asked how preparations were going. She reassured me everything was on schedule, but hesitation slipped into her voice at the end. She said some people had asked questions after seeing posts circulating locally. Something about conflicting injury accounts. She asked if everything was fine. I told her it was. But inside, I felt something shift. Not defeat, not fear, resolve. If Mark wanted to destroy my credibility, he would fail. He had tried to cage me with opinions before, and I had broken free. This time would be no different. As the ceremony date approached, I focused on training physical therapy and maintaining composure. Yet in the quiet moments, I replayed the whispers and the looks and the subtle shifts in people behavior. Every rumor was a reminder that some battles were fought without weapons. Some ambushes came not from enemies but from those who wore the mask of family. On the night before my travel back to Fort Carson, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the collar of my uniform for the 100th time. My reflection stared back steady but heavy with thought. Behind the strength, behind the discipline, behind the soldier, was the girl who had once believed the world inside that house defined her. Not anymore. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the small ache that pulsed beneath the scar, and whispered the question that had grown louder with each passing rumor. Have you ever seen someone try to destroy the accomplishments of their own family? The auditorium at Fort Carson glowed under bright stage lights that reflected off polished metals and freshly pressed uniforms. Rows of soldiers and families filled every seat, and the steady murmur of anticipation created a low hum that vibrated through the floor. I stood near the front of the stage with my palms flat at my sides, and my breathing measured the way training had carved into me long ago. The air smelled faintly of old wood varnish and starch from dress blues. A brass band settled into silence as Lieutenant General Richard Holbrook approached the podium. His presence alone commanded the room, tightening every spine and quieting every whisper. My name waited on the next page of his notes. When he stepped toward me carrying the Purple Heart in a small velvet box, something inside me shifted. It felt like standing at the edge of a long road and finally seeing the horizon instead of the footsteps behind me. The general paused before pinning the medal, and for a moment the room softened into stillness. I heard only my heartbeat steady strong despite everything my body had endured. Mothers held their children closer. Veterans leaned forward with respectful recognition. The faces around me held pride and solemn reverence. I let myself breathe into the weight of the moment, the kind that is supposed to lift you above old wounds and remind you that survival has worth. Then a voice cracked the silence like a hammer shattering glass. They gave it to her for bleeding, not bravery. Mark's voice echoed across the auditorium, bouncing off the high ceiling and crashing into 500 stunned faces. My chest tightened. For a second, I could not feel the ground beneath me. Heads turned sharply toward the third row, where he sat with his arms crossed and his mouth twisted in a satisfied smirk. His voice cut again louder, as if daring someone to challenge him. "Anyone can get hurt," he said, "but not everyone deserves a medal." A ripple moved through the crowd. Gasps, sudden inhales, disbelief. A woman in uniform covered her mouth. A soldier 2 rows back muttered something under his breath. Someone near the aisle whispered, "Oh, no." Heat swept into my face, but my posture did not break. Training held me upright, even while the wound of his words burned deeper than the shrapnel that had torn into my shoulder. The general froze mid-motion. His gloved hand hovered inches from my uniform as if the air around us had thickened. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the medal and turned his head. His gaze fixed on Mark with a stillness that felt dangerous, not loud or furious, but sharpened by a calm that carried power. The entire auditorium seemed to follow that stare, their eyes locking onto the man who had just contaminated a sacred moment. A silence unlike any I had ever known settled over the room. It was not shock anymore. It was judgment. The general stepped away from me and toward the podium, but instead of returning to his notes, he reached inside his jacket. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a sealed folder thick and stamped in bold letters. The sight of it made the breath catch in my throat. His voice dropped into a lower register, heavy and unyielding. "This soldier bled for her country," he said, each word ringing through the chamber. "But the real disgrace sits right there." 500 heads snapped back toward Mark. My stepfather complexion changed instantly, draining into a pale, ashy color. His smirk disappeared. His mouth barely held its shape. I felt the shift in the room, a collective narrowing of focus, like the moment before a truth detonates. The general opened the folder slowly, deliberately, as if giving the entire auditorium permission to absorb what was about to unfold. Papers rustled crisp and damning. Even from the stage, I could see the bold printed summaries, the highlighted paragraphs, the signatures that marked them as official. The general raised one page, reading it loud enough for every person to hear. Anonymous reports filed by this man accused Staff Sergeant Callahan of exaggerating her combat injuries in an attempt to gain benefits and recognition. A low rumble spread across the rows. People whispered angrily. Someone near the back gasped and said, "How could he?" The general lifted a second page. He said this one contains his signed statement claiming that her injuries were minor and that she fabricated details for attention. He folded the page slowly and looked at Mark again. "Sir," he said in a controlled voice, "you attempted to undermine a combat soldier record during and after a traumatic event. You tried to damage her credibility with lies." The weight of those words settled like a hammer on the room. Mark tried to speak, but only a choked noise escaped. A relative across the aisle buried his face in his hands. A woman near him shook her head in disbelief. The general then turned toward me and spoke with a steadiness that cut through the tension. This soldier did not exaggerate anything. Her actions during the convoy attack saved lives. Her injuries were verified through multiple evaluations. Her service is honorable. The only dishonor came from the man who sought to tear her down. When he faced the audience again, his expression hardened. For any family member in this room, let this be a reminder. Valor is earned through sacrifice. Jealousy is earned through weakness. The room erupted into applause, not loud or celebratory, but fierce, a protective wave that washed over me and drowned out the sting of Mark insult. I stood perfectly still, but inside, something fractured in a different way, not in pain, but in release. For the first time in my life, someone with authority, with power, with truth, had stood between me and the man who tried to break me. Mark stared at the floor, unable to look at anyone. His face was blotched, his jaw clenched in humiliation. And as the general placed the purple heart on my chest with a firm, respectful motion, I understood something with absolute clarity. The stage spotlight no longer illuminated an old wound. It illuminated the truth, and the truth stood taller than his lies ever could. The general held the open folder in both hands as if he were presenting evidence before a court rather than a room full of soldiers and families. The lights from the auditorium stage reflected off the plastic sheet protectors inside the folder, creating thin streaks of glare that made the documents look almost theatrical in their exposure. But there was nothing theatrical about what he revealed. His voice remained steady, but there was an edge beneath it, a controlled precision that hinted he had rehearsed this not for dramatic effect, but out of necessity. The truth needed clarity. The truth needed witnesses. He lifted the first document and adjusted his reading glasses. "This is an email," he said, addressed to Army Human Resources Command. It was sent from this man's personal account. The audience leaned forward collectively as if pulled by a single breath. I watched Mark sink deeper into his seat, his shoulders curling inward as though he could shrink out of existence. The general read the email word for word, letting the cruelty drip slowly into the room. He claimed Staff Sergeant Callahan faked her injuries during a convoy incident for the purpose of receiving unearned benefits. He stated she was exaggerating her medical condition for attention and financial gain. The words echoed brutally because they came not from an enemy combatant, but from the man who had lived in my house, the man who had eaten meals across from me, the man who had spoken at my graduation, the man who had told my mother he loved her. The murmurs began softly but grew rapidly like a spark finding dry grass. Soldiers shook their heads. A veteran near the aisle muttered unbelievable. A woman whispered something to her husband, who responded with a stunned, "What kind of person does that?" I stood still, but every muscle in my body felt locked into place as if bracing against an unseen blast. The general closed the first page deliberately, then revealed a second. "This is a formal request for investigation submitted anonymously," he said. Except it was not entirely anonymous. The office traced it back to his address. The room erupted into gasps, some sharp enough to slice through the tense air, others long and disbelieving. The general continued. The request claimed that Staff Sergeant Callahan had engaged in fraud by misrepresenting the severity of her injuries during deployment. The accusation was detailed and malicious. He let the silence after malicious stretch long enough for everyone to absorb it. Then he added quietly but firmly the accusations were proven false. The audience reaction shifted from shock to anger, a low hum that vibrated across rows like distant thunder. A man in uniform clenched his jaw. A woman placed a hand over her heart in disbelief. The insult of attacking a soldier's integrity, especially during wartime service, was something this crowd did not forgive lightly. Then the general pulled out the third document, and the tone of the room changed again. "This one," he said, "is a signed agreement between this man and a local tabloid publication in Ohio, dated the week following Staff Sergeant Callahan returned from overseas. It states that he sold photographs of her in the hospital without her consent." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. I felt them hit me, not in my scars or in my bones, but in the soft places I had learned to protect. The private spaces, the vulnerable moments, the images of me connected to machines drifting in and out of consciousness sold for a few $100s to a tabloid hungry for sensationalism. The humiliation pressed into my chest so heavily I thought I might lose my balance. Across the auditorium, outrage erupted louder than before. Someone demanded, "Are you serious?" Someone else said, "That is disgusting." A soldier in the back row muttered he sold her recovery photos. Even General Holbrook paused for a moment, his jaw tightening ever so slightly before he continued. His eyes fixed on Mark with a focus that felt sharper than anger. "Your stepfather attempted to sabotage your military record." That sentence landed in the auditorium like a dropped anchor, solid, heavy, unavoidable. The crowd reacted instantly. A roar of shocked voices rolled through the rows. People stared at Mark with expressions that shifted from confusion to revulsion. The betrayal was palpable in the air, thick enough to taste. No soldier expects their enemy to be kind, but to be attacked by someone claiming to be family, that was something the audience understood as a wound deeper than shrapnel. Mark tried to speak, but whatever sound he attempted collapsed uselessly in his throat. His face had drained to a sickly gray, and his hands trembled against the armrests. He looked around wildly as if hoping someone might rush to his defense, but no one moved. Not one person in that entire room found sympathy for him. Even my mother, who sat stiffly beside him, could not lift her head. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. I looked at her once, just once, hoping to find some hint of remorse or shame, or even recognition of the damage that had finally been pulled into the light. But she kept her eyes fixed on the floor as if truth itself had become too blinding. The general continued speaking, but his tone shifted from accusation to affirmation. He described the convoy attack in detail, the explosion, the injuries, the lives saved, the verification process, the confirmed damage to my shoulder and leg, the eyewitness reports from my team. His recounting was precise, the kind of precision military audiences trusted. "This soldier showed courage under fire," he said. "Her record speaks for itself. But today, the truth required a voice louder than the lies spoken against her." When he closed the folder, the entire auditorium seemed to exhale at once. A collective release of tension, gratitude, and righteous anger. This moment was not just about exposing Mark, it was about restoring what he tried to steal: my dignity, my service, my truth. And as the general stepped back to my side, preparing to finish the ceremony, applause erupted. Not polite applause, not gentle or formal. It was forceful, raw, protective, the kind of applause that rose from 500 people who had just witnessed the unmasking of a man and the vindication of a soldier. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar yet powerful. I felt free. The ceremony ended with applause that felt like a shield around me, but the moment I stepped outside into the cool Colorado air, the weight of everything settled onto my shoulders like a second uniform. My phone buzzed nonstop before I even reached the parking lot. 14 missed calls from the same number. 14 voicemails, all from Mark. I stared at the notifications without opening a single one. The idea of hearing his voice so soon after his public humiliation felt like reopening a wound that the general had just stitched shut. Silence, I decided, was my armor. Silence was the one language he had never been able to control. I put the phone in my pocket and walked straight to the barracks guest lodging without looking back. That night I lay awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner and letting the events of the day replay in slow fragments the blast of his outburst. The stunned faces, the general voice echoing through the auditorium, the gasps when the evidence was read aloud. For so many years he had twisted truth until I questioned my own memory, my own worth, my own voice. Now his cruelty had been documented, exposed, and witnessed by hundreds. Yet even in defeat he reached for control. The next morning my phone showed 3 more calls from him and 1 from my mother. Her voicemail was brief, spoken in a strained whisper. "He did not mean it, Avery. He was under stress. This has been hard on all of us. Please do not make this worse." I listened only once, then deleted it. Not because her words hurt, but because they were familiar. So familiar I could almost predict the next sentence she would have said if the recording had continued. Try to see his side. He is still family. Do not embarrass him. For years, she had chosen comfort over truth and silence over protection. But I no longer lived in that house, and I no longer lived under those expectations. I refused to carry their shame. By day 3, the messages shifted from excuses to desperation. "Avery, pick up. Avery, listen to me. Avery, you are blowing this out of proportion. Avery, you are ruining the family name." His tone grew sharper with each message until the final one arrived, late at night, slurred and angry. "I know you think you are some kind of hero now, but you are nothing without us. Nothing." I held the phone in my hand after hearing that, replaying the word "nothing" in my mind. Once it would have pierced deeply enough to draw tears. Now it only confirmed what the general had already revealed. His attacks were not truth. They were habit, a pattern, a weapon he used because it was the only one he had left. I saved each voicemail into a separate folder, labeling and dating them carefully. Not out of fear, but out of preparation. Silence was my weapon. Yes, but documentation was my shield. Meanwhile, my brother Ethan surfaced online in a way only he could manage, casually cruel and entirely predictable. A vague Facebook status appeared the next morning. "Some people will do anything for attention, even if it means betraying the ones who raised them." Within minutes, a handful of comments from his friends agreed with him, not knowing or caring about the truth. I screenshotted everything: his post, his replies, the people he encouraged with half-truths and insinuations. I filed them beside the voicemails. Evidence was not emotional. Evidence was neutral. Evidence did not lie. Over the next week, the distance between me and my mother stretched into something quiet and irreversible. She texted twice more, asking if we could talk. When I did not reply, she sent a third message saying I was being cold and punishing the family for one mistake. One mistake. I stared at the words long enough to feel their weight sink into me. What she called one mistake had been a lifetime of patterns crowned by a very public act of betrayal. Yet she clung to the idea that unity mattered more than accountability. I finally typed a reply, but deleted it before sending. Not because it was harsh, but because it was unnecessary. She did not want my truth. She wanted my compliance, and I had outgrown that role. Back at Fort Carson, my commander checked on me twice, asking if I needed time off or support resources. I thanked him, but told him I was fine. Not untouched, not unshaken, but steady. He nodded with a look that carried no doubt, only respect. Soldiers know what it looks like when someone survives more than one kind of battlefield. At night, I walked the base perimeter when the sky turned deep blue and the mountains looked like dark shoulders guarding the horizon. With each step, I felt something loosen in me, a kind of quiet reclaiming. My life had always been loud with conflict or expectation or fear. Silence had once felt like punishment, but now it felt like choice, like freedom. At the end of the week, I listened again to the first voicemail just to see if anything in me shifted. It had not. Then I deleted all 14. I kept the files in the evidence folder, but the messages themselves no longer needed residence in my phone. My silence was not avoidance. It was a boundary. A firm, visible, undeniable boundary. And boundaries were something Mark never expected me to build. On day 9, an envelope arrived from Ohio with my mother handwriting on the front. Inside was a letter written in uneven lines telling me she missed me, that things were being blown out of proportion, that Mark felt humiliated and ashamed and needed compassion, not punishment. She asked if I could come home for a weekend so we could talk face to face. I folded the letter once, placed it back into the envelope, and stored it with the voicemails and screenshots. Another piece of the story, another confirmation that silence was still the correct response. I looked at the folder one last time and whispered the words that had taken 31 years to form clearly. I am not your stability. I am not your excuse. And I am not your victim. Then I closed the folder, breathed deeply, and let the quiet become my ally. The scandal from the ceremony spread faster than anyone expected. I had not shared anything online, but every person in that auditorium had a phone, and every phone had a camera, and within hours, clips of the general reading, Mark Actions Aloud, circulated across Colorado news pages, then jumped to national veteran forums. By the third day, the video hit trending lists titled, Variations of Stepfather Humiliates Soldier at Purple Heart Ceremony, and the comments sections lit up with outrage from strangers who saw more clearly than my own family ever had. Mark's job at the logistics company in Toledo evaporated within 48 hours. Officially, they cited reputation concerns, but everyone knew the truth. He had made himself the villain in front of 500 witnesses, and the internet had carried his behavior to the rest of the world. I did not celebrate his downfall, but I did not mourn it either. Actions had consequences, and for once those consequences did not land on me. A week after the ceremony, I was walking across Fort Carson toward the motor pool when I saw a figure standing by the front security checkpoint. He looked oddly small against the towering metal gates. It took me a moment to recognize him, even though I had known his posture like a shadow for most of my life. Mark. His shoulders slumped, his tie uneven, as if he had dressed quickly and sloppily. His eyes scanned the cars entering the base until he saw me in uniform and lifted his hand in a shaky wave. I felt the air tighten around me, but I kept walking because avoidance was no longer something I practiced. 2 military police officers stood nearby, watching him closely. He stepped forward only to be stopped immediately by a hand raised firmly in warning. "Authorized personnel only, sir." His voice cracked. "I am here for my daughter." He said it loudly enough for the people in line behind him to hear, and a few heads turned. The word daughter stung in my ears not because he used it, but because he believed he still had a claim to it. I approached calmly, my boots steady on the pavement, my breath even and level. The MPs stepped back just enough for me to speak with him without breaking regulations. He opened his mouth with a desperate rush of words. "Avery, thank God. I need to talk to you. Everything is upside down. The media is twisting it. You have to tell them I was just emotional. You have to fix this. Tell them I am not the monster they are saying I am." His voice shook as he talked faster, scrambling for control. "I lost my job. Your mother is terrified. Reporters keep calling. Please, Avery, you need to clean this up. You know how people exaggerate things." His hands trembled as he reached out, but I did not step closer. For years, he had demanded accountability from me, even for things I had not done, yet now faced with the consequences of his own behavior. He looked to me to save him. It would have been almost laughable if it were not so predictably tragic. "You expect me to defend you after what you did," I said quietly. The MPs tensed, waiting to see if he would cause a scene. Mark swallowed and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. I was upset. I drank too much coffee that morning. I was nervous. You know I say things without thinking. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Avery, please. You owe me at least an explanation. Tell me why you are letting them destroy me." That was the moment it became clear he still did not understand. He had humiliated me publicly, attacked my character, undermined my service, and yet the only thing he cared about was his image, his comfort, his narrative. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel the weight of it. Then I said the words that rose from a place in me that had been silent for far too long. "Stand up. Dignity was not taken from you. You gave it away." He blinked as if the sentence physically struck him. For a second, I thought he would lash out the old familiar flash of temper in his eyes, but instead, his knees bent suddenly and he dropped to the ground in front of the gate. Not a slow, intentional kneel, but a collapse fueled by desperation. People in line gasped. The MPs stepped forward immediately. "Sir, you cannot kneel here. This is a restricted point of entry." He held up his hands, pleading. "Avery, please, I am begging you. Help me. Tell them I am not the villain. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Think about your mother. She is barely sleeping. Everything is falling apart." I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years he had stood above me towering in anger. Seeing him now on his knees revealed the truth. He had never held power. I had simply never taken mine back. I spoke clearly, so there was no mistaking the meaning. "You are not here for reconciliation. You are here for damage control. I will not protect you from the consequences you created. Get up and leave." He stayed frozen for 3 long seconds, then looked up with something like disbelief. "So that is it? You abandon family when things get hard?" He spat the words as if they were poison. I did not flinch. "You are not my family, Mark. You never were." One of the MPs stepped beside him. "Sir, you need to leave immediately, or we will escort you." Mark tried to get up, stumbled, then finally stood, brushing off his wrinkled slacks. He stared at me with a mixture of fury and bewilderment, as if he could not understand how the dynamic had shifted so permanently. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the parking lot, shoulders hunched, head low, steps unsteady. I watched him go without regret, without guilt, without the ache that used to settle behind my ribs whenever he raised his voice. When he disappeared from sight, one of the MPs looked at me with quiet respect. "Are you all right, Staff Sergeant?" I nodded. Better than I have ever been. As I walked back toward the motor pool, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the pavement, and for the first time since the ceremony, I felt the light reach me too. My silence had drawn him out. His downfall had revealed itself, and the battle for my own peace was finally turning in my favor. The morning after Mark showed up at the gates of Fort Carson, I woke with a strange clarity settling over me, like the cool air that slips into the barracks before sunrise. For years, every conflict with him had followed the same cycle: anger, chaos, apology, pressure, guilt, silence, repeat until the next explosion. But this time the pattern had cracked, and in the quiet space left behind, I realized something simple and undeniable. Boundaries meant nothing without enforcement. Silence had protected me, but it was not enough to keep him from trying to invade my life again. So I drove to the El Paso County Courthouse just after opening hours, parking beside a row of dusty pickup trucks and government vehicles. Inside the clerk office, the air smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. I waited in line behind a woman holding a stack of family court documents and a man petitioning for custody modification. When it was my turn, the clerk greeted me politely, asking what I needed. I took a breath. "I would like to file for a civil protection order." Her expression softened as if she had heard those words from soldiers more times than she wished she had. She handed me a packet of forms printed with detailed instructions outlining the legal standards for harassment threats and endangerment. I sat at a table near the window, filling out each section slowly, methodically, listing the events that led me here, The voicemails, the public humiliation, the attempt to enter a federal installation, the pattern of intimidation that stretched back years. Writing it all down sharpened the memories, but instead of weakening me, it steadied me. The truth on paper had weight and structure. It did not shrink under pressure or twist itself into excuses. When I finished, the clerk reviewed the forms, stamped them, and directed me upstairs to the judge intake office. A security guard escorted me through a metal detector, then pointed me toward a hallway lined with chairs. The wait was quiet, except for the ticking of a wall clock. 15 minutes later, a court officer called my name. The judge, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes, skimmed the paperwork, asking precise questions about the incident at Fort Carson and Mark past behavior. I answered clearly, focusing on facts, not emotion. When she finished reading, she looked at me steadily. Based on what you have described and the evidence provided, I am granting a temporary protection order effective immediately. There will be a hearing scheduled in 14 days. Until then, he is prohibited from contacting you or approaching your residence workplace or any military facility. Do you understand these conditions? I nodded, feeling something uncoil inside me, a string that had been pulled tight for more than a decade. When I walked out of the courthouse, the sun was high bright and almost startling against the pavement. That afternoon, the sheriff department delivered the paperwork to Mark residents in Toledo. I did not see it happen, but the report later confirmed he had opened the door expecting a package only to receive a folded set of court documents restricting every avenue he had once used to reach me. The officer serving the papers noted that Mark's reaction oscillated between indignation and disbelief, repeating that I had no right to do this. But rights no longer rested with him. They finally belonged to me. Within hours, Ethan jumped into the chaos in the only way he knew how, by turning on his phone camera and launching a live stream from the front porch like he was broadcasting breaking news. He ranted for 20 straight minutes, pacing back and forth, blaming me for tearing the family apart, insisting the ceremony had been exaggerated, accusing me of weaponizing the legal system against an innocent man. His comments filled with supporters who did not know me and strangers who enjoyed conflict, but within minutes the tone shifted. Someone posted the viral video from the Purple Heart ceremony under his stream. Another commenter linked a local news article summarizing the general public statement. Then, a veteran group shared screenshots of Mark's earlier hostility. The tide turned like a sudden rip current. The audience that had been cheering for Ethan began calling out the hypocrisy, asking why he defended a man who humiliated a soldier on stage. Several veterans began posting their own experiences with toxic relatives and applauding the restraining order. The chat flooded with pushback. One viewer wrote, "You are missing the point. Your sister deserves respect, not harassment." Another said, "Accountability is not betrayal." The backlash escalated until Ethan abruptly ended the stream, leaving behind a trail of angry comments and a community he could not manipulate. I watched silently from my laptop, absorbing the reality that for the first time, the narrative was not controlled by my family. Truth had taken root and grown louder than their distortions. Later that evening, I met with a base legal officer who helped me organize my documentation for the upcoming hearing. She walked me through the procedures, how to present evidence, how to stay focused, if Mark attempted emotional manipulation, how to answer the judge questions concisely. Her professionalism anchored me, and as we finished, she said something that struck deeper than she knew. Protecting yourself is not an act of aggression. It is an act of survival. Driving home that night, the lights of Colorado Springs flickered beneath the mountain range, and for the first time in months, my chest felt less constricted. My life was no longer shaped by avoidance or fear. The protection order did not erase the past, but it carved a clear line in the present. A line he could not cross without consequence. A line built of law, not hope. At home, I placed the court-stamped copy in a folder beside the saved voicemails and screenshots, forming a record of my journey from silence to strategy. I had spent most of my life reacting, bracing, enduring. Now I was building something steadier, a future shaped not by old wounds, but by boundaries chosen with intent. And as I turned off the lights that night, I whispered to myself a truth I had never allowed before. I am protecting my life the same way I protected my unit, with clarity, with courage, and with absolute resolve. The first therapy appointment felt more intimidating than any battlefield briefing I had ever stood through. Combat had rules, even chaos followed patterns, but healing required something I had spent years avoiding: stillness. I walked into the behavioral health clinic on base 2 weeks after filing the protection order, carrying a knot of tension between my shoulders that felt like it had been there since childhood. The waiting room was quiet, decorated with soft colors and framed photos of mountain landscapes. Nothing about it resembled the environment that had shaped me, but maybe that was the point. When the therapist, Dr. Monroe, called my name, she greeted me with a steady calmness that made me exhale without meaning to. She guided me into her office, a warm space with a small lamp, low lighting, and a chair angled across from hers, but not confrontational. After basic introductions, she said, "I understand you have been carrying several kinds of trauma for a long time." I nodded, unsure where to start. She leaned forward slightly. "In this room, you do not need to be Staff Sergeant Callahan. You only need to be Avery." I did not realize how tightly I held my military bearing until that moment when it cracked just enough for honesty to slip through. I began explaining the events of the ceremony, the protection order, the years of verbal jabs, the attempts to undermine my confidence, the childhood chores that felt less like responsibility and more like punishment. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable but compassionate. When I finished, she said something unexpected. "Before we address the trauma from service, we need to talk about the wounds that existed long before uniform and rank. Those usually shape how you survive everything that comes afterward." She assigned me a grounding exercise, something she called emotional mapping. She asked me to imagine the earliest moment I felt unsafe in my own home, and to place my hand over the part of my body where that memory still lived. I hesitated, but eventually pressed my palm over my sternum where the familiar tightness always settled. She nodded. "Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget." That sentence struck deeper than I expected. Over the next sessions, we dug into the years before deployments, before chain of command, before medals, before trauma had names and diagnoses. I told her about being 12 years old, scrubbing floors, while Mark watched television, about being told I was dramatic whenever I expressed pain, about Ethan being praised, even when he did nothing, about the first time I realized my mother's silence was not protection, but surrender. As I spoke, the tension in my chest tightened, then released, then tightened again, like a rhythm I had lived with but never examined. Dr. Monroe did not push, she guided. She explained how childhood survival strategies often become adult reflexes, the same reflex that kept me alive after the explosion in Kandahar had once helped me endure emotional blows at home. "You did not lose a family, Avery," she said during one session. "You escaped one." Those words did not feel like comfort. They felt like truth sharpened enough to cut open a locked door. That night, I began writing in a journal, not because she suggested it, but because something inside me needed a place to put every memory that surfaced, every ache, every realization. At first, the entries were simple, short recaps of sessions, but gradually they deepened. I wrote about how I had learned to anticipate tone shifts in Mark's voice, how I had learned to monitor Ethan moods, how I had carried responsibility like armor, how silence had been both my shield and my cage. I wrote about the explosion overseas, about the dust in my lungs, about the soldier I pulled to safety, and how after surviving that, I still returned home afraid of a man who had never faced anything more dangerous than his own reflection. Each page became a release, a step toward reclaiming narrative control. One afternoon, during our fourth session, Dr. Monroe introduced a technique called narrative reframing. She asked me to describe my story not as a victim recounting events, but as a survivor identifying chapters. She said, "Trauma steals context, but healing restores it." I started speaking slowly, hesitant, but then the words found their rhythm. Chapter 1. A child who learned to be strong because no one else would protect her. Chapter 2. A teenager who saw the military not as escape, but as structure, truth, consistency. Chapter 3. A soldier who earned respect through discipline, not fear. Chapter 4. A woman who survived both war and the people who were supposed to love her. As I spoke, the tightness in my chest loosened enough that breathing felt easier, cleaner. Therapy did not erase pain, but it translated it into something understandable, something that no longer controlled me. Another exercise involved identifying inherited beliefs. She asked me to list all the sentences Mark had repeated over my life. You are too sensitive. You should be grateful. You owe this family everything. No one will want you if you cannot handle criticism. Then she asked me to challenge each one with observable truth. The process felt like prying nails out of wood, but each extraction made the structure inside me sturdier. The more I challenged the lies, the smaller they became until they no longer dictated my decisions. One breakthrough happened unexpectedly after a long session where we discussed the ceremony. I admitted that part of me still feared people believed Mark's words even after the general exposed him. She asked, "What evidence do you have that his words still define you?" I sat in silence, then whispered, "None." And that realization felt like stepping into a room with windows after years in a basement. The journal entries that week shifted noticeably, the handwriting steadier, the thoughts clearer. For the first time, I wrote the sentence, "I am allowed to be whole." Dr. Monroe encouraged me to create a list of truths to counter every false narrative I had internalized. I wrote, "I do not owe contact to people who hurt me. I do not need anyone's permission to protect myself. I am allowed to outgrow the people who tried to shrink me. I did not lose a family. I escaped one." That last line became my cornerstone. Every time doubt crept in, I returned to it, reminding myself that distance was not abandonment. It was survival. It was clarity. It was reclaiming my life. As weeks passed, therapy shifted from excavation to rebuilding. We focused on routines, small habits that nurtured stability, morning stretches, evening walks along the base fences, healthy communication guidelines, rest days that did not feel like indulgence but necessity. The journal thickened with entries full of questions and answers, reflections and progress. Each page felt like another step away from the past, another step toward a version of myself I had never been allowed to meet. And slowly, the woman in those pages began to feel real. Not Staff Sergeant Callahan, not the daughter of a cruel man, not the target of old wounds. Just Avery, a whole person in the making. Returning to Fort Carson after weeks of therapy felt like stepping into a different version of the place I had known for years. The base had always been structured, disciplined, predictable, but now it carried something I had not felt in a long time, a sense of belonging that was no longer tied to survival, but to support. The morning I signed back into full-duty status, the sky over Colorado Springs was clear and sharp, the kind of blue that made the mountains look carved out of steel. As I walked toward the company building, a few soldiers noticed me and offered small nods or quick smiles, gestures that felt heavier with meaning than any words could. Word of the ceremony had traveled far beyond the auditorium. Soldiers talk bases, share information, and the story of a general exposing a toxic stepfather had spread across units like a quiet wave of solidarity. That afternoon, my platoon sergeant told me there was a mandatory formation in the rec room, which immediately made me suspicious, since mandatory formations rarely happened indoors. When I walked in, the lights dimmed for a second, then flicked on, revealing a banner stretched across the wall, hand-painted and uneven, but perfect. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant Callahan." Below it stood 25 soldiers from my unit, holding paper cups and wearing expressions that blended pride with something deeper respect. My squad leader stepped forward, holding a small box. "We wanted to give you something to mark the day on our terms," he said, clearing his throat. "We figured the ceremony you had got ruined, so this one is just for you." I opened the box to find a simple wooden plaque engraved with my name rank and the words, "Your courage is louder than their voices." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but instead of swallowing it down the way I used to, I let the emotion sit without shame. The celebration was quiet, but heartfelt, with bad coffee jokes, about army food, and stories shared about deployments and near misses, and the strange humor soldiers lean on to survive. It was not grand, but it was real, and for the first time in a long while, I understood what family was supposed to feel like. After the gathering, my commander requested I take on a new role, mentoring younger soldiers as part of the leadership development program. "You have been through more than most," he said, "but more importantly, you learned how to rise through it." They need someone who can teach them that grit. The responsibility felt right, almost natural. Over the following weeks, I spent evenings in the training bay reviewing weapon maintenance with new recruits and mornings leading resilience classes where I taught skills I had learned the hard way: boundary setting, emotional awareness, recognizing manipulation, and distinguishing loyalty from obligation. The soldiers listened closely, drawn not by rank but by honesty. One evening, a young private named Harris lingered after everyone else left, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the courage to speak. When she finally did, her voice shook. "Staff Sergeant, I do not know if this is appropriate, but I do not have anyone else to talk to. My father keeps telling me joining the military was a mistake, and that I will fail. He says I am embarrassing him by being here." The words hit me like an echo from another lifetime. I motioned for her to sit, and she sank into the chair, eyes glossy with tears she fought to hide. She explained how her father belittled her ambitions, dismissed her achievements, and claimed the Army had brainwashed her. Every sentence she shared peeled back a memory of my own past. When she finally broke down crying into her hands, something inside me moved instinctively. I knelt beside her, pulled her into a steady, grounding embrace, and murmured the words that had taken me 3 decades to fully understand. The uniform does not lie. People do. She froze at first, letting the sentence absorb, then cried harder this time, not from despair, but from a release long overdue. I stayed with her until her breathing steadied. When she pulled back, her expression carried a strength I recognized. It was the same strength that grows in someone who finally hears truth spoken louder than fear. After she left, I remained in the empty room for a while, letting the quiet settle over me. I realized the choice to heal had led me here to this exact moment, standing not in the shadow of the family I had escaped, but in the center of the family I had built through service, loyalty, and shared adversity. Over the next weeks, other soldiers slowly opened up too, sharing small pieces of their stories, trusting me with fears they had never admitted aloud. The more they confided in me, the more I realized the purpose that had been forming in the background of my recovery. I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me. I was shaped by what I chose to give back. And giving back did not weaken me. It strengthened me. During morning runs with the unit, I felt my stride lengthen, my breath deepen, my steps growing lighter. In the dining facility, soldiers waved me over to join their tables, something I used to avoid out of habit but now accepted because community no longer felt dangerous. It felt earned. At night, as I wrote in my journal, the pages reflected a transformation unfolding quietly but powerfully. The entries shifted from recounting pain to recording progress, from surviving to rebuilding. I wrote about laughter in the barracks, about teaching a private how to disassemble an M4 without panic, about the moment a recruit who had struggled through training finally passed her qualifying test and ran to me first. Little victories, meaningful ones. By the end of the month, I realized I was waking up in the mornings without dread for the first time since childhood. No footsteps to fear. No insults to brace for, no manipulation to decode. Only purpose, steady calm, and the steady rhythm of a future I was no longer running from. I was building it piece by piece, surrounded by people who saw my worth without trying to take it. Family of choice, not obligation. Family built by respect, not fear. And as I looked around the base that had once felt like a refuge but now felt like home, I understood something simple and profound. I had not rebuilt my life from the ashes of the past. I had built something entirely new, something stronger, something mine. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped beneath my apartment door in a plain white envelope with my name written in a handwriting I recognized instantly. Mark handwriting always leaned too hard to the right, like the words themselves were trying to outrun responsibility. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope, feeling nothing sharp, only a quiet certainty that whatever was inside could not touch me unless I let it. I picked it up, carried it to the kitchen table, and laid it flat, but did not open it. The silence in my apartment felt steady, not tense like it had once felt, and that alone reminded me how far I had come. After an hour, I finally slit the envelope open with a butter knife, more out of ritual than curiosity. The letter was 3 pages long, but the message repeated itself over and over. Avery, please give me another chance. I made mistakes. I was under pressure. I was provoked. I did not mean to hurt you. I am suffering. Your mother is suffering. We cannot survive this without you. It felt like reading an echo of every excuse he had ever used, dressed up in new language but still hollow. There was no accountability, no acknowledgement of the damage he caused, just a desperate plea for me to repair the fallout of his own choices. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back into the envelope, and set it inside the folder with all the other documents. Then I closed the folder and felt an unmistakable truth settle inside me. Not answering was not cruelty, it was clarity. The following morning, I woke before dawn, pulled on jeans boots and a plain sweatshirt, and drove north toward the small cemetery in Toledo where my father Callahan had been buried 20 years earlier. The highway stretched wide and empty, the horizon growing brighter as the sun edged upward. The closer I came to Ohio, the quieter my thoughts became, as if my mind understood this journey was not about Mark at all. It was about ending something older, deeper. Something I had carried since I was a child, standing beside a casket too big for my understanding and too small for the man inside it. When I reached the cemetery, the gates were open and dew glistened on the grass. I walked the familiar path past rows of markers until I reached the stone with my father's name etched into granite. Thomas Callahan, beloved husband, father protector. I knelt and brushed dried leaves from the base, remembering the warmth of his hands, the steady tone of his voice, the way he had carried me on his shoulders before the illness took him. Losing him had left a void that Mark had tried to fill not with love, but with control. Now, standing at the exact place where my childhood had split into before and after, I felt the weight of everything I had survived. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet wrap around me until the air felt still and deliberate. Then I spoke. The words came not with anger, but with truth. I honor the man who raised me, not the man who tried to break me. Saying it aloud felt like unlocking a door I had pressed against for years. The wind shifted lightly, brushing against my face as if the air itself acknowledged the release. I stayed a few minutes longer, then placed my hand on the top of the stone, a gesture of farewell not to my father, but to the version of myself who had tried so long to carry grief that never belonged to her. When I finally stepped back, the sun had risen fully, casting long shadows across the headstones. I walked toward the exit with a calmness that felt unfamiliar and steady. As I reached the gate, my phone vibrated with a new message, but I did not check it. Whatever it was could wait. Closure did not need an audience. It only needed a decision. Back in Colorado, life resumed with its quiet rhythm. Training schedules, morning runs, leadership briefings, mentoring younger soldiers. Each task grounded me in the present, reminding me that my story no longer revolved around the man who had spent years trying to shrink me. My life had widened beyond him, and he no longer had the power to narrow it. Days later, I returned to therapy. When Dr. Monroe asked if I had responded to the letter, I simply shook my head. She nodded approvingly. "Not every chapter needs dialogue," she said. "Some simply need to end." I left the session feeling lighter. In the evening, I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and wrote the final entry of that chapter. Closure is not forgetting. It is choosing which memories deserve space in my life. My father deserves space. My growth deserves space. Mark does not. When I closed the journal, a deep silence filled the room, not empty, but complete. Later that night, I stepped outside onto my balcony, overlooking the dark outline of the mountains. The air was cool, the world quiet, and for the first time I understood that healing was not a single moment, but a series of choices. And I had made the most important one. I chose myself. As this chapter ends, I have one question for anyone who has walked a similar road. Have you ever been hurt most deeply by the person who should have protected you? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one.